All right, let me open and we will begin. Father, again, we are thankful for another day you've given us, and we're thankful for the time that we can be together to open a portion of your word. We're thankful that some of us can gather physically. We have others who are ill or who are traveling, and we would ask your attention for them as well. Again, we thank you for your goodness, for your provision. Now we ask for your guidance as we discuss and think about these portions of your scriptures. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So let me welcome you to Grace Covenant Baptist Church, Monroe, Louisiana, on the, what is today, 23rd day of February, on this rainy Sunday morning. For those of you that are listening or watching electronically, in Louisiana, we have about 2 weeks of winter. And we've had our 2 weeks of winter. When it warms up, it rains. So it's warmed up and it's raining this morning. So I put out a map, before we get started, I put out a map on your tables. For me, and I'll only speak for me, but for me, it helps when I read something in a text to be able to have some kind of geographical marker. So this is places that Paul has been talking about, both in 1 Corinthians, and we'll see that he's also talking about them in 2 Corinthians. So if you look at the lower left-hand corner, you see Athens. Remember in 1 Corinthians, he was in Athens, and then he goes over to Corinth, which is just across that little piece of land there. That landmass is also known as Achaia, which we've referenced in other places. So if you go to the right, across this body of water, around all the islands, you come to Ephesus. Remember, Ephesus is where he wrote the text we know as 1 Corinthians. It's not mentioned in 2 Corinthians, I don't think, but we've seen it in 1 Corinthians. So if you go up, go north, this map is oriented to the north. If you go up, you'll come to Troas. Now, Troas is mentioned specifically in this text. Keep going northwest. Again, across that body of water, you come to Macedonia. Now, Macedonia has been mentioned several times, both in 1 Corinthians and we'll see in 2 Corinthians. A couple of places there. You'll notice one of the cities is Thessalonica. I don't think that's mentioned in 2 Corinthians, but it is mentioned in other places. And the one that's not on this map, if you go back to the right in that other little indentation there, in that area, we would find Philippi or Philippi, and it's also mentioned in several places. So, okay, that's laying you up. Like I said, that helps me. I thought perhaps it would be useful. Okay, we are going to continue our discussion this morning in 2 Corinthians. But before we begin to unpack that, I want to make two detours. With your indulgence, I'm going to detour twice, okay? Without objection? If you've been studying 1 Samuel with us on Wednesday night, you know that we have recently seen that David was in a very difficult period of life. And as we have seen, and as we will continue to see, Paul is in a very difficult period of life. So we saw how David responded initially, probably not with the wisest decision. And we'll see how Paul responds to his difficulty. And we can't push this comparison too far. But an applicational point, this does point out that we have a choice about how we respond. Now, I'm going to push pause. I'm reading a book by Samuel Ranahan, and he talks he wrote this book out of a series of sermons he preached out of 1 Peter. And he talks specifically about how Christians could and would respond to anxiety, so-called anxiety and depression. Jeffrey Johnson, in his book, The Absurdity of Unbelief, also talks about some of this thing. So what we want to look at is that we have a choice about response to all of these difficult situations. So that's the first detour. The second detour, I want to return to. I want to pick up on a concept that both Lamar and Paul David had introduced previously in some of these pericopes. We know that Paul consistently talked about the gospel in one form or another in all of his writings, and that includes the text we know as 1st and 2nd Corinthians. So in this frame, in this context, I want to look at a topic, so to speak, that some of us heard at Deep South from Don Elborn. In that sermon, he talked about the power that saves. Okay, so hang on to that thought. Then we're going to do some cross references. We're going to do some grammar. So I'm thinking, oh no, not no more Greek grammar. So I'll try to make it as painless as possible. We're going to start with some cross references. We're going to go first of all to Romans. Find Romans. And that's where we're going to start. And then go one chapter to the right to 1 Corinthians. Put your finger there, because that's where we're going to spend the bulk of our time. Everybody found Romans? Okay, we're going to Romans chapter 1, verse 16. Very familiar verse. We all know this. We've studied it. We've thought about it, whatever. It says, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the" what? Power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, the Jew first and then the Greek. Now we want to think about three concepts that we find in this verse. We want to think about the concept of power. We want to think about the concept of salvation. And we want to think about gospel or the gospel. So based on this verse, what is the power for salvation? That's not rhetorical. Yes, gospel or the gospel. Now, that concept in and of itself, I would assert, is a relatively simple concept to grasp. Now, we also know that the gospel contains a lot of other stuff, a lot of components and whatever. But if we take that as a whole, it's relatively simple and easy to grasp. Not necessarily easy and simple to do. But as a concept, it's fairly easy. So, we've said that the power for salvation is the gospel, okay? We're agreed. We all agree with that? Any objections? Okay. So since the gospel is the power of God for salvation, if we reverse engineer that, it begs the question, what is not the power? So in the contemporary evangelical church, what are some things that are not the power for salvation? Okay? Are we on the same place? Huh?
Man's choice.
I'm sorry.
Man's choice.
Well, yeah, that concept. Can you think of some others? What goes on in our contemporary churches that is not the power for salvation? Okay.
Praise, worship.
Okay. What else? Oh, come on, guys. We've talked about this infinitum.
Faith,
Huh?
faith,
Faith?
just simply a proclamation of faith.
Okay.
If it says gospel is, then not gospel is not. So anything that's not the gospel, anything that's not the good news of Christ is not the power of salvation.
Okay. That's completely re-engineering this, but I agree. Anybody think of anything else?
That one back here.
I'm sorry? I still didn't hear you. Oh, tongues. Okay. Are the current contemporary use of that, so.
Just say gibberish.
Gibberish, okay. Oh, we're recording, I can't say some things, so. Okay, so some of these things we could perhaps roll up into entertainment. Would that fit?
Oh, yeah.
So when we think about entertainment as a function of the contemporary church, that is not the gospel. What do we think about? And Lamar, you've already said music. What else? What goes into that entertainment piece?
Lights.
Hey, hang on to that one. I'm coming back to that one. Okay.
I think when we're thinking about a message that contains the law and the gospel, if the gospel is the power of salvation, then the law is the power, you would say, condemnation.
Okay. Now, you got to be pretty theologically sophisticated to make that distinction, but I agree with you, so.
Sophistication is also not the gospel.
Yeah. Okay, so let's pick on music for a little bit. I've heard it called happy, slappy music. I had a young woman in another venue tell me one morning that she had juicy and bubbly worship. I suggested to that young woman that she really ought to try to find out what worship is. I think I offended her, and I never saw her again, so, okay. So it's music, or the so-called praise and worship music. It's music which has redefined worship. Yeah. And as Paul David said, sound and lighting, effect, sound and lighting. That's to vary the levels of sound, to vary the levels of lighting, to create an effect.
I think that we get to so many people trying to define what worship is, and I think that the definition of what worship is should really lie in what is being worshipped, who is being worshipped.
Yeah.
So your opinions about worship shouldn't matter near as much as God was being
Yeah,
worshipped.
yeah.
And he tells us how he should be worshipped.
In fact, somebody wrote a book entitled The Worship Wars. Anybody read that? I've got it. I've never read it, but,
It misses the point anyway.
okay. Well, like I said, I don't know what's in it, but
The
I like
Scandal of
the-
the Evangelical Mind would be a much better one to read.
the what?
The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind.
Okay, I don't have that one. So one of the things that we would say is not the power for salvation is this whole concept of entertainment in the church. So how about a watered-down version of the Scriptures? Now, that covers a lot of territory. But we could say in that instance, it's not preaching the entire counsel of God. And somebody mentioned that earlier about leaving stuff out, watering it down. So why is that done? If we accept the fact that that is going on, and most of us would accept that fact, why? Why is that done?
Not liking what's in there. Not liking what's in there.
Okay. What else?
Well, I'm just gonna say that all these things we're discussing has to do with, it's almost like the church is trying to sell products here to call it gospel. It's up to the individual to buy this what we're selling, but that's not the gospel. God comes and saves those who been predestined for the foundation of the world. We must believe that he has the power to save them. Pastor Rusty's sermon is gonna go hand in
Oh, really? Well, good. Judy and Rusty taught my Sunday school lesson last week, so now we're going to turn the tables a little bit. So, okay. So part of it is this watered down. I won't even call it gospel. It's a watered down presentation. And if you think about that, basically, the reason is to attract and to hold attendees, or we might put in parentheses, the crowds. Okay? It has been called easy believism. Get lots of benefits, very little commitment, very little effort goes into it. Fire insurance, some folks have called it. So that's another concept, that's another piece that's not power to save. So the things we've been talking about, this is kind of generally, it's known as syncretism. It's borrowing stuff out of the secular environment and bring it into the church, again, to attract a crowd or to hold a crowd. So. Now, since we're looking at Paul and his writings, does Paul have anything to say about this particular concept? And obviously the answer is yes. Go to 1 Corinthians, numero uno, whatever, 1, ein, zwei, drei, vier, fünf, six, never mind. We're going to look at chapter 3, and we're going to look at verses 1 through 3a. Are we there? I hear pages still turning. I didn't know Robert was going to be here, so I dog-eared all my pages so I can turn them. Okay, we there? Said, but I, brothers, could not address you as spiritual people. Now notice that, could not address you as what? Spiritual people, but, contrast, as people of the flesh, as infants. Infants where? In Christ. 2, verse 2, I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you are not ready for it. It what? Solid food, which we would interpret as what? The gospel. Now, he doesn't say that here, but that's the implication. Said, even now you are not yet ready. Why? Because you're still in the flesh. So it's that concept of worldly or fleshly stuff that you're in and is being brought into many of our contemporary churches. Okay. So, can you think about what another concept or another activity is that is not the power for salvation? This one will set your hair on fire. Anybody think of something else?
Setting your hair on fire, that's a new form of worship that I want.
Yeah. Yes, like handling snakes. Same concept. No. The next one is, okay, hang on, here it comes. Our personal testimonies are not the power to save. Oh, yeah. Our personal testimonies are important. In some context, in some situations, they're influential and they're useful, but they are not the power that saves. Let's go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 1. Again, we're going to hear from Paul. And notice this is the I-when construction. We see that a lot. Said, and I, when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God, in some sense that is the gospel, with lofty speech or wisdom. So even Paul says that doesn't work. Okay, next one. Here's another goodie. The ability to talk someone into something. is not the power for salvation. We often think about that as persuasion, but it could also be coercion. So, folks, out of a good Southern Baptist tradition, where do we see that happening? Typically. Yeah. What?
The invitation, same thing.
Okay, altar call. Yeah, a la Finney. Where do you see it exaggerated, if I can use that term?
When the new convention is coming in and everybody hits the streets with their prepared stories.
Okay, I'm thinking a little more simplistic than that.
So we're just going out there and we're gonna get this many souls today.
Okay, where do you hear that? Where does that typically heard? Revivals, evangelistic conferences. Now, as far as I know, we don't do those kind of revivals much anymore. But it's often encountered, like I said, in evangelistic crusades and revivals and so forth, used, and I put used in caps, by an evangelist or speakers designed to elicit a response. Now, remembering when you were in one of these things, what was one of the mechanisms that was used to get this response?
Fear.
Okay, yeah, fear, but how? I mean, what was the mechanism?
We was at a teen retreat, and the preacher begged everybody to come down front, all the teenagers.
Yep.
And it wound up being one boy sitting out there in the middle of a
Yep.
church of 100.
Peer pressure.
And he said, "Son, you don't want to go to heaven?"
Yeah.
And the boy finally got up and come on down there.
Yeah.
They make them want to fear hell, so go to heaven, anyone go to heaven.
Yeah. It's that, and that is pure manipulation, by the way. Okay, y'all are missing the obvious one.
The singing,
Multiple repeated verses of just as I am, almost persuaded, those are two that come to mind. Yeah. Everybody stand up, bow your head, close your eyes, and you've got 97 verses of just as I am.
I see that, man.
I'm coming to that, hang on to that one.
I think when this coercion, I think it was Dale Carnegie said, those convinced against their will remain of the same opinion still. And so if you can convince someone through this repeated brainwashing, was to keep someone else from rewashing their brain and, starting over and making them believe something completely different.
Yeah. So over the tinkling of the piano or the softening down of the organ, you've got a speaker saying repeatedly, come to the front and do what? Make a decision. That is fundamentally, that is coercion. It's also, in some instances, manipulation, because what else happens? Y'all are good Southern Baptists, think about it. What else happens?
repeat after me.
Well, yeah, that's the prayer. That comes later. Sometimes,
Joining as members.
well, again, that's later. Sometimes, usually not staff, but sometimes other church members will be encouraged to come to the front and pray. Again, pure manipulation. It promotes,
To break the ice, they do that in Stephen Furtick's church. I think the biggest coercion in Southern Baptist life is, man, someone's gotta go forward, because if we're not released after this, the Methodists will beat us to the
yeah, you gotta hurry up, I'm hungry. That promotes the kind of stuff you were talking about, where you got kids, you got one lonely kid sitting back there. And I'm gonna digress here just a tad. That is a group therapy technique. It promotes fatigue. And what do we know about fatigue? When we're tired, we make bad decisions. So these are some of the things that we see, some of the things that we've probably been involved in at some point that are not the power to save. And again, Paul talks about this directly. Let's go to, again, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 2. This is one we know well. And he says, I decided. Now, that's an interesting phrase. I decided. He had the ability to decide one way or another. So I decided to know nothing among you except what? Christ and him crucified, which in his most simplest terms is what? The gospel. So again, we see Paul talking about the gospel repeatedly in a number of different texts in a number of different ways. So if we kind of put all that together, we might say that we see that the power of God for salvation is the gospel and only the gospel. Okay? All right, so that was my second detour. Before we leave it, thoughts, comments?
There's one other manipulation that I carried, when I carried about 35 kids from my Fellowship of Christian Athletes to a get-together this year. And what the speaker did there was when he got ready for his altar call, he said, I want everybody to just bow your heads in prayer. Now raise your hand if you want us to pray for you. So you got all over the building, kids are raising their hands. And after he prays for them, then he says, now, if you meant that prayer and you want to do business with God, you need to come forward right now and give your heart to Jesus. And that, all my kids looked at me and said, what do we do? I said, sit right there.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to sit them up there.
Yeah.
That's not very a million more in 1954.
Oh, well, I remember that one. I remember that one.
Yeah, and then, what's next in 76? I mean, you got all this, when we prioritize these numbers, that's great and everything, if those numbers actually mean something, but if I'm just making production, like I'm working in a factory, helping BDS kids to the front to do something, when they have no idea, because they have no counsel.
Yeah.
I'm just putting rings on the baptism part,
Yeah, the thing, Lamar, you're describing is what Paul David said a while ago. I see that hand back there. Have you ever looked up to see if there was actually a hand back there?
I think all of this comes down, remember when we used to make those shirts for the Friday Night Parking Crew?
I do.
So there was a shirt one year that said, "Ology matters."
Yeah.
Yeah,
And you think all of these things come down to a theology matters.
Yeah.
Why do these hokey, manipulative, coercive practices? Because there's an underpinning theology that naturally leads to those things. People say, well, this obligation, what does all that matter? Then the day somebody say we're saved. We're saying the same thing. Well, hold on. Theology matters.
Yeah.
It produces a result. And action comes in your life because of a belief that you have. Theology drives action.
Yeah.
You believe the stuff like this. Or
yeah, yeah.
I think it comes down to if you had something to do with your salvation, that's just a step away from I have something to do with someone else's salvation. Man, I need to get them to do what I did because I'm better than them. My work. So you need to help them do your work.
Yeah, let me digress again just a minute. Any of y'all that have done counseling at a rally or a big deal, if you legitimately sat with a kid and talked to that kid about this decision, and he says, I don't know, how does the staff respond? Okay, I would bet you're not invited back to be a counselor anymore. Anybody ever had that happen? No. Yeah. Some of us have. So, and that's a whole nother topic that says some things about some other things, which we'll let go. Okay, any other thoughts about these things that are not the power? All right, well, then let's begin to unpack the text that we're here for today. As I said, we're in 1 Corinthians. We're going to be looking at chapter 2, verses 12 through 17. And we've seen previously, when we did the introduction, we've seen that some of us like to outline books. You know, we want to look for the chiastic arrangements, and we want to get the paragraphs. Well, 2 Corinthians is extremely hard to outline. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, it's an emotional book. We'll begin to see Paul in his state. He's emotional about this. It covers a variety of topics. But one of the major things is that it has parentheses. Now, we've talked about that before. Well, we know when Paul writes, he'll be going along just with some theological stuff, and then all of a sudden he shifts. It's almost as if he puts a parentheses. 2 Corinthians has a huge parentheses. Beginning at about verse, some people say 12, some say 13, some say 14, all the way through, hang on to this one, it was all the way through chapter 7. So we've got part of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We've got 7 chapters, or parts of 7 chapters, in this parentheses. So it makes it really hard to be able to outline this. Now, talking about this parentheses, one writer says, here is the clearest explanation in all of Scripture of the secret of Paul's phenomenal ministry. It runs from chapter 2, verses 12, 13, through chapters 4, 5, 6, and ends in verse 2 of chapter 7. So that's a huge chunk of stuff. He goes on to say it's a splendid example of what genuine, true, authentic Christianity is. So this great passage is a parenthesis in the 2 Corinthian epistle. It's a digression on Paul's part. So we know that Paul's been talking about and talking to the Corinthian church and the Corinthian people. And we know that in that frame, he's been talking about the pressures he's undergoing. He's been talking about his problems. He's talking about the problems in Corinth. We know that he's waiting on Titus to come back from Corinth with news of what's happening in the church. And when Titus finally gets there, he tells him that everything's going pretty good in the church. There's good news, everything's going pretty good in the church. But he also tells him some bad news, that there's a group of people that have been basically spreading lies about him. So we know he had said he was going to make another trip to Corinth, and he changes his mind, and they picked up on that to accuse him of a lot of different things. So this parentheses seems to come as a spontaneous outburst of Paul to kind of counteract his sense of failure and despair that had been generated with the difficulties in Corinth and with the accusations that these folks are making against him. So a lot of these remarks would have been injurious, whatever, would have injured him. But it's particularly hard at this point in time because he's emotionally and physically depleted. Says such charges would have been hard to endure at any point. They were especially hard at this time when Paul is suffering, as he describes it, overwhelming stress, a combination of fears without and fightings within, and we'll see that again later. Was producing both mental and physical exhaustion. So Paul is not typically one of his writings where he defends himself. He does some, but not a lot. But at this point in time, in this text, he seems to almost feel as if he's compelled to defend himself, because not to do so would be injurious not only to Corinth, but to other places where he's preaching and establishing churches. So he does take a sense of self-defense here. And reading between the lines, we see that because the word boasting occurs in 2 Corinthians about 29 times. And that's telling, as like I said, as we read between the lines. So, okay, all that said, let's start where we're supposed to start. We're going to start in verse 12. That when we're in 2 Corinthians now, chapter 2, verse 12. Don't you hate it when somebody shifts references on you and doesn't tell you? 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 12. It said, when, time phrase, I, Paul, came where? To Troas. And we found Troas on our map. To do what? Preach the gospel. So again, there's that concept of gospel. Even though a door was open for me in the Lord. So let's take this apart a little bit. Coming to Troas, we found that itinerary in 1 Corinthians 16, and we also find it in Acts 16. So we've got other scriptural documentation for why he's going there. Now the next phrase, this is an interesting phrase. It said, even though, or when, some translations say when, a door was opened for me in the Lord. Opened is a perfect passive participle. Now remember what participles do? What do participles indicate? A nature or continuing action. So the sense here is that God had opened this opportunity for the gospel, and it remained open. And then Paul's going to leave. Okay. The term open door is a popular metaphor for Paul. He uses it in a lot of different places. He's used it in 1 Corinthians. He's used it in Colossians. He's used it it is used in Acts. And it's also used by John in Revelation. So it's not an uncommon metaphor. And the phrase emphasizes the effective power of God through the redemptive, accomplished ministry of Christ and the calling of his Spirit for the purpose of evangelism and Christian discipline. So the open door metaphor, the sense of that has that meaning. We find that in another very popular verse, Matthew 28, 19 and 20. We all know that one. We find it in Acts 15 also. Okay, so Paul said, I came to Troas even though or when a door was open for me in the Lord. So that concept that he came up there to do that, and that opportunity still continued. Now, verse 13. This is where we begin to get some sense of his difficulties. Verse 13 says, my spirit was not at rest. And he quotes a specific instant, because I did not find my brother Titus there. Okay, we're going to hang on to that second phrase just a minute. So his spirit's not at rest, and he says specifically because he couldn't find Titus. Now, why would that distress him? Huh? Well, yeah, they're close. Okay, we have to do a little history. Paul had sent Timothy to Corinth. Now, there's some disagreement about whether Timothy went or whether Paul himself went, but they didn't receive them very well. Remember? We talked about that, some time ago. They wouldn't let him teach. So whoever it was, either Timothy or Paul, they wouldn't let him teach. They basically mistreated him. So Paul writes this letter that we don't have anymore. That was very disciplinary, very abrupt, we might say. And he sent that letter with Titus back to Corinth. Now, he's written this letter, he sent it, he's waiting to find out how they responded, blah, blah, blah. He's waiting on Titus to come tell him. He is concerned, I would think, about the letter he wrote. If you discipline an employee and you don't call them into your office and talk to them, you send them a letter. Now, if this employee is important to you, you're waiting to find out how he's going to respond. Does that cause some stress? Yes. So that's kind of where Paul is. He's waiting to find out what Titus is going to tell him. So when Titus comes back, when he finally gets there, he tells him, everything's pretty much okay in Corinth, but you've got these other problems. So in verse 13, that's the setting when he says, my spirit was not at rest because I did not find my brother Titus there. There's also disagreement about where Titus actually came to. Based on this verse, it would seem that he came to Troas. But there are others who assert, based on other things, that he actually went to Macedonia, maybe Thessalonica or maybe Philippi. So that particular detail really doesn't make a whole lot of importance. So when he says, my spirit was not at rest, let's do some grammar. Here do I hear the groans? Oh, no, not grammar. The use of spirit here, when we read spirit through our New Testament filters, we typically think of Holy Spirit. Well, that's not the case here. Spirit here is synonymous with a person or a human. So Paul's talking about himself. He's talking about his internal state, his internal being. And we have seen that he left. Paul left an open door in Troas because of his concern and fearfulness about the church at Corinth. Now we'll see that transition again in a minute. And he's concerned, as we said a minute ago, he's concerned because he loved the church. Remember, he had been there for, 18 months or so, maybe 2 years, preaching, establishing that church. Then he leaves to go back to Ephesus, and he gets word from Corinth that things are not going well. So he writes what we know as 1 Corinthians to address those issues. But he really cares for these people. He really cares for this church. And he has a continual concern. Now, how do we know that? Go to chapter 7, 2 Corinthians chapter 7. Verse 5. It said, for even when we, plural pronoun, notice, came to Macedonia, ours, plural pronoun, had no rest, but we, plural pronoun, were afflicted at every turn. And this is the quote we heard earlier, fighting without and fears within. Now, when we begin to break this down, afflicted is Strong's number 2346. It means to press as a person in a crowd, to weigh down, to burden. Here's the key. Afflicted is a present passive participle. So the sense is that this was an ongoing season or an ongoing stress, that this is continuous action. It doesn't tell us that, the verb doesn't tell us that, but the sense is that this had been going on for some time and that it is continuing. And when Titus doesn't show up, we could think that that just exacerbated the stress he was feeling. So. And we talked about him sending Timothy to Corinth and then sending the letter back to Corinth with Titus. Okay, next phrase. So I took leave of them, plural pronoun. Who is them? We have several places where we've got this plural pronoun. Could be the people. Who else might it be? Could be the people in Corinth. Now, not physically leaving, but leaving some of that concern. Could be all of the apostles, some of which are with him, but some are not. Probably not that, because there were apostles that weren't there. Could be Paul and his immediate team. Or, in a more general sense, it could be all believers. Because what he's fixing to do, he's fixing to initiate this parentheses. And he's about to tell us some stuff. And I hate to say it this way, but I can't think of any other way to say it. He's about to tell us some stuff that he used or that he allowed to happen that helped him with all of this distress and discomfort. So this begins with this phrase. So I took leave of them and went to Macedonia. So this is the beginning of this 5 or 6 chapter parentheses. And as we'll see, we're not going to get to it today, but as we see, this is a digression of praise to God for Christ. That's the theme of this entire parentheses. It's been described as a digression that is both beautiful and helpful, and many of Paul's most memorable quotes come from this digression. Okay, I'm going to give you back 1 minute, and we'll wind up and get ready to go upstairs. So, briefly, thoughts, questions, comments, objections, digressions.